I would like to do is just, as many people have done already, is share my experiences of this project. So I'm not presenting this in any way as being this is the only way to do it or necessarily the best way to do it, but I just want to show how I've approached it in my subject, which is visual arts, and hopefully you'll be able to see the links between what you've heard in language and primary teaching and in maths and science with visual arts. To me, this question, this guiding question, can creativity be taught, is something that engages me very much. So again, I came to this project hoping that by applying this framework, learning how to use it, I could better reach the aims that I have. I also found when I started using it that I would try and do the steps through a whole unit of work, and also through individual tasks. So within each task I would also try and use the framework to increase the room for thinking, to try and get them to build this generic description and this algorithm, and also to reflect. The reflection is a big part of the IB programs anyway, so students always have to reflect, and they're also used to reflecting in my lessons, so that isn't something that's particularly new for them. That for step one, I want to change the learner's attitude from expecting to be able to do the task to recognising the need to work on a more challenging task. So I'm changing the things that I give them to make them more challenging. And then the function for me is to make typical non-thinking tasks into tasks that allow more room for thinking and that I can also measure. Okay, so this is my first task. The first task that I had and that I was going to focus on today is this task about public sculpture. And I have a guiding question because within the IB we always have a guiding question for the students to work with. And then what I also do is I tend to go back to my own curriculum and think about what exactly is it I want them to learn so that by the end of them I can assess it. So these three here are my assessment objectives: knowledge and understanding, application, and reflection and evaluation. So at the end of this unit, I will assess the students on these three areas, and this is specifically what I will look for. So in creating this thinking task and creating this unit of work, I have to hit all of these objectives. So I have worked a lot with the sorting tasks, and it's very similar to the way that the tasks are used with sentences, except it's not sentences, it's images. And again, I'll pick out things that I want them to see, but I don't necessarily tell them. So for example, in this grouping here, including this pile down here, there are 2 Holocaust sculptures from different countries with different audiences. And I'm hoping that by doing their sorting, some of the things they'll actually start to see is what needs to be included for something to be a memorial. What needs to be included for the Holocaust? How do people react to these very difficult situations and create art in different communities? So for this starting point, I select the images. And the first one that we do is this very straightforward, the odd man out. It's very simple, they can all do it. One of the things that I have learned by doing this is to restrict the time. I've been talking about this with some people, and I used to think, oh, they need plenty of time, they need to talk. And then when I came to watch some of the TA teachers teaching here in Latvia, I realised that I was giving them too much time, and that more time does not actually mean better thinking. So I'm now much stricter and say, okay, the first task, you've got 2 minutes. And normally they're still, they've dropped it on the floor and they're looking for their pencils, and so it's about trying to get them to actually work within a limited amount of time. And then after that, we move on to the eliminate one image at a time. And at this point, I have quite a lot of images for them to work with. But again, I give them the time limit so that they have to stay focused on what they're doing. And these 2 students, we have no pointers, so I've got to do this with my finger, were new to the class and new to this type of activity. And then the next thing is to ask them to sort in as many different ways as we can. And this is the start of them actually, without realising it, beginning to sort into values and parameters. And also, what I think, if you see the boy with the red jacket here, is that he works standing up. And I never tell the students that they have to sit down. They can move as they want, and there's always, always children who want to work standing up, always. So he spent the whole lesson standing, working, and everybody else was sitting down. With the younger kids, they really like it if this is a competition. So when I've done this with the 6th and the 7th graders, I've said, you know, the highest anybody's ever got, and then I make up a number. I just make it up, 83. Can you get higher? And they just love it. And they just sit there, and a lot of what they write is complete nonsense. But it does get them to think, and it does get them to think of as many different ways that they can sort. And what I've also found, and again somebody mentioned this earlier on, is that for some of the students who like to get the right answers, these types of activities are very difficult. So this student in the middle is academically very strong and used to getting, likes it very structured, this is how it's going to be, there's one right answer and I'm going to get it. So she found this very difficult. But some of the other students, who are the academically weaker students, tend to find this very easy. And I group them myself. I don't let them pick groups, because otherwise they just work with their friends. And I vary the groups depending on what I want out of the activity, and it's very politically incorrect, but quite often I put all the weaker students together and all the stronger students together. And what I've found by doing these sorting activities is that for almost the first time ever, these weaker students are allowed to shine, that they actually do better than the groups with the stronger students. And the absolute amazement on their face when they realise that they've got more interesting values and parameters, or they've got more values and parameters, is worth doing it in itself. So once they have, I'm the art teacher, so we've got lots of coloured paper and things like this. Once they have the ways that they've sorted them, these are written down on the white pieces of paper. So they've got rock, stone, marble, bronze, and then I ask them to group them together and give that group a name. So the group name becomes the parameter, and all the little sticky pieces of paper are at this stage our values. And at this stage we're not being terribly selective, we're just putting them all together to see what they look like.
I kind of feel like taking away the geometric shapes and having shapes as a parameter and geometric shapes as a parameter. Is that possible?
What do you think?
I think that's probably a bit more proper considering the topic.
Okay.
So I find it really interesting because immediately you're there, they feel there's a right answer. What's the answer? Tell us the answer. And they stop that interaction. And you can see Anne, who was sitting there, is going, that's what I said, you were just ignoring me, I said that 5 minutes ago. You know, so you see the dynamics of how the students work together. And that particular student has got a very interesting way of making connections. And he often does just think out loud. And you know, that discussion he was actually having with himself about should it be geometric shape or shape, I'm not quite sure, was what I find very interesting, and what I'd like to work more on in this idea of developing thinking is how does the dialogue function in this. Okay, and then I asked them to come up and share the models that they've made. So they've made these little E and B models from their parameters and their values, and then they come up and write on the board. And these are 14, 15-year-olds, and everybody still likes to come up and write on the board. So a lot of it's just, you know, that sort of idea that they can teach somebody else. And then sometimes I then take other images of sculpture just to try and get them to test their parameters and value. Okay, if we only have these parameters to describe, can you pick one of these and write down the values? And then I get the other students to guess, because these are all really quite similar. You know, they're all similar material, quite similar. When they say has humans, doesn't have humans, they realise that's not actually enough information, because if you've got things where it's all humans and not abstract, what else do we have to add in as parameters in order to make it useful? Okay, so once they've done that, I've been trying to work with these algorithms, which I find quite confusing, and quite often I find that I end up confusing the students as well. But you know, we're working through it together, and this is my attempt at doing this. So they select all the parameters. This is June's work here. She's written her parameters, and the reason that, although these slides aren't great, I just want you to see that it is a student's work. This is what it looks like. You know, when it's all typed up, it doesn't really show their thinking, and I even like to see the way that they divide their pages and how do they choose to use the spaces. So these are her parameters that she wants to make an algorithm, and this is the actual algorithm that she ended up making. So these are her steps for describing a sculpture. What kind of colours, number of figures, where is it shaded, is it inside or outside, all sorts of things. But this is her algorithm that she's devised from these sorting tasks and from testing it. Okay, and then she's selected another piece of sculpture, completely different, because by this stage I asked them to collect images. I want them to bring to school images that they feel are interesting, important, challenging, a bit like using the authentic texts again with the students. So she's chosen this image. This is something she found that she likes. And then she's tested out her algorithm by describing it here, and then done a little bit of work on what are the steps that are missing. So she's added a few more steps by testing this out. What I've asked them to do then as a final sorting task is I've asked them then to change purpose. So in the group, one of them picks a sculpture and gives it to somebody else and asks them to change the purpose of it. If this was for a memorial, what would you change? If this was for a public open space, how would this piece of work change? And by then they have to use the correct terminology, they have to understand words like texture and line to be able to do this task. So this is the final task in context with limitations. They have to design and create a maquette, which is a small model of a sculpture that's suitable for a specific place and purpose. So they have to start with their artistic intention. This place is, this is why. And then they can come up with something themselves, but some themes that you will see in every town and city in the whole world might be historical hero, victims of war, terrorism, natural disaster, for a specific country, open space or public buildings such as airport or train station. And in between I also give them a lot of information about sculptures and examples from around the world and how people interact with them. So in between all these things I've done some traditional teaching as well. And then this again is June. She wrote the memorial. And she's decided that for her sculpture she actually wants to create a memorial for Utøya. And especially the fact it was teenagers, and we were given these actually directives from the government of what to say, you know, in class and what to do, which, you know, of course we all followed. But when given the chance to explore things, 3 students in the class chose to take this as their topic. They decided that they wanted to sort of work through their own understanding of this by creating a piece of art for this. So for the purpose, you know, she's actually identified the purpose, and her purpose is to allow the people who come to the sculpture to feel somebody else's pain. You know, to actually understand, to generate sympathy, and to create a place where people who are affected could come to grieve. So we discussed all the different possible uses of a sculpture, and this is what she chose. And then, interestingly, for her event, she decided that this particular event was a historical event, a natural disaster, and an act of war. So she's combining all of these things. So it allowed them to process their own understanding, and at the same time, I could work with the students who'd chosen this topic in the class and allow them to talk about how did they feel, what was their feelings of grief about this. Everybody knew somebody that was affected, so by putting it into a real life context, it allowed for other experiences that they may not have in school and other subjects. Okay, this is her final sculpture, which might not make a lot of sense because I've cut out all the planning stages. But the camp was run by the young people's section of the government. It's the working party government, and their symbol is a red rose. And all over Norway, people were laying down red roses. So this student after doing some research, decided that the rose was a very important symbol, and she was going to create a sculpture that would be made of permanent roses using the colours of Norway in this teardrop. It's actually cut as a teardrop shape that's covered with roses. Another student, this is his ENV model for his sculpture. This is a German student, born and brought up in Norway, but with German parentage. And he decided that he wanted to make a sculpture that represented the unification of Germany after the Berlin Wall came down. And his purpose, this is the ENV, the parameters are here, and the values. The purpose was to remind of the losses. The loss of people while the wall was up, trying to escape the divided country, and to express the pointlessness of separation. And also to show that Germany can't be separated. So for him it was this feeling of national pride and cultural importance that he wanted to express. And then he's gone on to where should it be, what are the different components that it should be. So he produced some, they all have to research and plan. And then this is his final sculpture for his. And then the last one, this is a student who is very weak. And the good students will manage anywhere, and you'll see when you see the final one, you know, the skills aren't quite there. But I wanted to see, giving somebody this framework to work with, does it help them to creatively think? Does it help them to structure their thinking? So this student, you know, you can tell by the skill, has written his algorithm, and then this is his ENV of his angel sculpture. He's going to do an angel sculpture. And then his element is a futuristic angel who's thrusting upwards. And then his description, his name, he's done his description, and then his value. He's flying above the ground, but he's placed on a see-through stick. And then you can see from the next slide, like I know it's a bit like, it's not the best sculpture, but the interesting thing is, he's actually used here, he's written out his algorithm and then used this to design the planning drawing for the sculpture. Now, obviously, getting from here to here was a bit too much, but he was really proud of this. Like, he actually, going, it's lovely, you know, there's a pipe cleaner meant to be showing, and he just wrapped it with sellotape, and, you know, I was just like thinking, oh, I haven't taught him anything. But again, he was really proud of it, and for me, the interesting bit was how the algorithm helped him come up with the design. And then just to show that they're not all at that level, this was somebody else's sculpture. And guess what this theme was? It's not easy, is it? Except it is, when I tell you, it's very easy. Okay? This was a sculpture representing nationalism in a country that has a royal family. So, you know, they're picking out the elements, and this was, you know, this sculpture was this size. He made this big piece of work. So everybody in the class does something different. And then, this is some other examples. I've tried to incorporate this into almost all my lessons. So with this class, I wanted to see if we could create an algorithm for making, like, constructing a sculpture. And I chose to work with the constructivists. So these are some of the images at the start, from the sorting task. And also, I asked them what did they know. They didn't know anything about constructivism, which is why I chose to do this. And then I digressed because I find that I'm not a systematic thinker. And when I'm teaching, I think of all the other things that we should do. So I asked them, how are you going to find out about constructivism? And then of course it was very simple, you know, on the internet. And then I said, okay, what about if you're not allowed to use Google? You can use the internet, but you can't use Google. And they were completely stumped. So it made me realise that even though we're teaching research skills in all these subjects, when it's coming to research, they still can't do it. They just want to put it into Google, and that's the answer. And then I added more limitations by saying you can't even use a computer. And the whole class were just like, they didn't know. They didn't know what to do, which is really frightening because I have books all over my classroom. And eventually one of them said, I could ask the teacher, and it's like, yes, that would be a start. And then for another 5 minutes, somebody said, maybe go to the school library. I said, wow, imagine that, school library might be able to give you some information. So it was interesting to me to see how the gaps in their knowledge, you know, how they were. So we actually digressed and made an algorithm for creating research. How do we research? And then went back to this. So this is, these are the steps for constructing a constructivist sculpture. And then the student listed them all down. I also wondered, now somebody last night, who shall remain nameless but is not in this room, told me that, well, you know, this thinking, it's okay, but, you know, not in like real subjects, and what do you teach? So I teach visual arts. Oh, well, that's okay then, because it doesn't really matter, does it? You know? And then, this is why I want, well, I had this on anyway, but I thought this shows, because these are my older students. I teach diploma as well, the 16 to 18-year-olds. And I teach diploma in a maths and science high school. And I think that they have no idea what I'm doing there and don't understand the value of why art's in the diploma when it's maths and science, possibly languages, that count. And these students now, the exam that they take does count towards the diploma. If they fail my subject, they fail the diploma. They don't get into university, and it's my responsibility. So as you teach older students, the responsibility also increases. So I want to make sure that they can achieve as much as they can, and how I can help them. How can I apply this, particularly this ENV model, in order to allow them to increase their creativity and do as well as they can in the exam. And with the older students, this was my breakthrough. I love this. This is my Firebird. It's not my Firebird. It's Paulina's Firebird. And she wanted to create this Firebird, and she was completely stuck. So we used this ENV model, we did it together on the board, and we looked at how can you break down fire into parameters and the values. So we broke down, we had 3 parameters. She chose colour, movement, and shape. And then she looked at what are the values of these. And then she decided how many of these values can I change and it still becomes fire. What's the line for it becoming completely abstract and something else? And it was like this changing moment for both her and for me, because I realised that I could use the ENV model to teach analysis, that it could help the students analyse their own work, analyse existing artwork, and put them together to create something that was new and different.